Whereas in pre-modern states, and certainly in the Islamic political model, central government's functions were limited essentially to matters of security and the regulation of the mint, the modern state has become a monster whose tentacles stretch into every horizon of the citizen's life. Our education, justice, health, and other key dimensions of our existence are subject to meticulous state regulation and control. And money itself, the key indicant of value, is valued and created by the state's central bank. Money does not come from mines in God's solid earth, but is pieces of paper whose value is determined by central policy, rooted in economic theories on which there is, as it turns out, no consensus at all. Here again, Islamic values insist on personal freedom. A private currency whose worth is essentially outside the power of central banks to determine is to be the essential measure of exchange in a Sharia system. Unlike, say, the Bitcoin, whose claimed libertarian advantages have not really outweighed the problem of its volatility, gold and silver, the naqdain, allow private individuals considerable freedom from manipulation by states and corporate interests. The naqdain also provide insurance against unexpected haircuts, levies, and other state-imposed interferences with personal wealth. And when the ATMs finally stop doling out cash, the naqdain will truly come into their own. All this perhaps seems to you to be of more relevance to Islamic banks than to Islamic charity, even though the two can really hardly be disentangled. But perhaps we can now begin to make the point that if we, as conscientious and believing human beings who abhor the relativism of modern values and the human suffering which results from living in our modern hall of illusions, we will find it tricky to create a fully Sharia-compliant banking system. It's true that Islamic banks represent a vastly preferable alternative to conventional usury finance, not only because they try to invest ethically, avoiding investment, say, in alcohol and other narcotics, but also because they tend to be comparatively well capitalized and to avoid some of the more esoteric and parasitic financial instruments which make banks vulnerable in times of sudden recession. During the 2008 crisis, the Islamic banks generally fared fairly well, although there were some embarrassing exceptions. However, the money in which they hold their Sharia-compliant deposits is not the naqdain, but euros and greenbacks. Hence, they are inextricably part of the global net of fiduciary money, and as such, they cannot really escape its volatility, or, if the whole system goes down, its collapse. This is not to say that the experiment has been bogus, as claimed by some purists. In our strange global environment, one is always looking for the least bad option. Sharia compliance these days is basically a matter of degree. Let us remember Islam's traditional realism. Still, let us also consider that the Islamic economic vision is not limited to the creation of banking services. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, the third pillar, which relates to justice, actually is not about banking at all. It is zakat, a statutory purgation of our fiscal bloodstream. So perhaps the creation of institutions such as the National Zakat Foundation, benefiting from London's stringent charity and financial regulatory environment, represent a more interesting area in which to develop our campaign to offer an ethical and also realistic alternative to the current destructive economic paradigm. Let's hold that thought for a while. Islamic banks often, unfortunately, recycle assets among wealthy investors. Much of the fancy London skyline is now the result of Middle Eastern and Malaysian speculation. The Olympic Village is one example. The makeover of Battersea Power Station is another. There is One Hyde Park, Harrods, Chelsea Barracks, and look just down the road at the Shard, which was partly financed by Sharia-compliant instruments. Walk through the dismal and depressed streets around it, as I've just done, and it's by no means clear that the ethical imperatives of Islamic banking have in practice delivered at ground level to the streets of Southwark. It may even be the case that the influx of Gulf money to the safe haven of the London property market has helped to drive up house prices in the capital with grave consequences for the poor. Islamic banks tend to invest in Mayfair property portfolios, not in affordable housing. This is hardly very Islamic. A zakat initiative, however, would by definition make a difference to those streets.